Chelek Chav Beis, volume 22, the Sicha for the last days of Pesach. This Sicha is a wonderful insight into the reason why we are not only not stringent any longer, but in fact we make a point to consume gebrokts, that's matzah shruya, on the last day of Pesach, and how it connects to the Geula. So as an introduction, to familiarize ourselves with some of the concepts that will be discussed in the Sicha, first of all, matzah shruya, gebrokts in Yiddish, which basically means any matzah that comes in contact with any whatsoever liquid, especially water, throughout Pesach. We're very careful about that not happening. In fact, we're so stringent that we don't even put matzah on the table. We make sure that in no way whatsoever there should come any contact between matzah and liquids. Now, this is not only a stringency, so to speak, a Chabad custom, but rather it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe discusses it at length and actually gives the reasons. He makes the point why this should even be a common practice for everyone, as in the origin, the prohibition of chametz is a biblical one. It's a very strict one. And this is just based merely a precautionary measure in that regard. And therefore, it's a very serious thing. Another thing to familiarize ourselves with, the Gemara tells us about a certain sage, Rav Acha, who made it a point to, when he obtained his hadassim for the dalad minim for Sichos, he made it a point to purchase dafka, specifically a hadas which was perhaps mediocre according to all standards. But he made it a point, that became his preference, although it wasn't the optimal type of hadas. It wasn't the optimal type of branch that he could take for the mitzvah. Why did he do so? Because his Rebbe, Rav Kahana, was the one who said that in a case of need, meaning if there's no other choice, that is also a permissible hadas. For him, this became so sacred, this became so important, that for him this became a point of preference. For him, as the Gemara says, Kivan the Nafik Mipuma de Rav Kahana, since it had exited the mouth of Rav Kahana, his Rebbe, for him this became the ideal. In other words, we find that sometimes when your Rebbe says something, even though it's just kind of like a heter, but the fact that it's your Rebbe that put down this heter, for you it becomes the preference. Another thing, we know that on Shavuos, on Chag HaShavuos, the festival which comes after Pesach, they offer the Shtei Halechem. The Torah instructs us to make a special offering of the two breads, but these two breads are very unique. Whereas the entire year, all the menachos, all the meal offerings in the Beis HaMikdash were specifically and deliberately, exclusively from matzah, meaning they were not allowed to be chametz, they were not allowed to be leavened. These shtei halechem, these two breads, had to specifically be leavened. Another thing to familiarize ourselves with, there are many mitzvahs that are chayva. Chayva means they're obligatory. They're imperative. You have to do it. Like for the first night of Pesach, you have to eat a piece of matzah, at least a kazayas of matzah. But then there are many mitzvahs which are rishus. Rishus means they are voluntary. For example, consuming matzahs on the rest of the rest of the days of Pesach. The consuming matzahs the rest of the days of Pesach is not an obligation. It's not imperative. If one wants, as long as one does not consume chametz, one can eat whatever they want. They can eat potatoes, they can eat meat, they can eat eggs. They're not obligated to consume matzahs. And as we'll see in the Sicha, Chassidus explains that when something is rishus, meaning it's not obligatory, it's not imperative, rather it's a voluntary act, it actually is because it's actually higher in the spiritual realm than that which is imperative. One more last thing, the Haftorah. Whenever we read the Haftorah, the rule is that the Haftorah has to be me'ein haparsha, meaning it has to have a connection. It has a very intricate and inherent connection to the theme of the parsha, or me'inyana d'yoma. It has something connected to the essence of the day. In other words, it brings out, when we, for example, on the festivals, when we read a Haftorah, it brings out the essence of that day, of that specific celebration, and what it's all about. So let's get into the Sicha. So in regards to the stringency of not eating gebroks on Pesach, we know that the Alter Rebbe writes, quote, "Hamachmir tova alav bracha." One who's strict on this should be blessed. And then after he continues explaining details pertaining to this observance, to this custom, he concludes and he says, "Taima rabba ika b'milsa lihizor mechshash isa daraisa." There's great reason for this. This is not just merely some kind of superfluous stringency, but rather there's great fundamental reason for this, as this is a precautionary law in order to be extra careful when it comes to a biblical prohibition. But then he concludes with the following words, Umikol Makar. However, B'yontav ha'achrein, in the last day of Pesach, which is Achrein Shel Pesach, Hamekel, one who is lenient, Mishum Simchas Yontav, because of the joy, in other words, to increase extra joy of Yontav, and now to be able to avail themselves to more types of foods and pleasures, Lo Hifsit, he does not lose out, meaning he doesn't lose out on this very important mitzvah. Now, the way it comes out from the Alter Rebbe, it seems like you could be lenient. It doesn't say you should be lenient or that you must be lenient. However, in actual practice, what we find is that by all our Rabbeim, the Lubavitcher Rabbeim, we find that in the Seudis, in the meals of Achrein Shel Pesach, not only were they somewhat lenient and let the guard down a little bit, but rather they made a deliberate point to eat gebroks, not only just one time, but in every single dish, to make sure to mix into it some matzah. That means in the fish, in the soup, in the meat, whatever it was, to make it a point deliberately to do gebroks. Now, if every single minhag, every single Jewish custom, we say about it, minhag Yisrael Toirahi, that there is a lot to be learned from it, how much more so when it's a minhag of our Rebbes. Now, how do we explain it? So to start off, the Rebbe says perhaps we can explain it this way, that they did it in order to increase, to maximize the Simchas Yontav, right? The Alter Rebbe says that if one is lenient, in order to increase, in order to enhance the Simchas Yontav, then it's okay. So maybe that was their motive. However, says the Rebbe, that cannot be the reason. Why? Because we didn't find them to do this, to dip their challah or their matzah, whatever it is, on Sukkot or on Shavuos. In other words, this is not an inherent aspect of their Simchas Yontav. There seems to be something more to this. Now, perhaps the Rebbe suggests another explanation. Maybe this is in order to make a distinction, a differentiation between the first 7 days and this last one. That could be a good reason, but still, it wouldn't explain why they made it a point. They went out of the way to do it in each and every single dish. In other words, doing it once would have already made that differentiation, would have already told us the first 7 days is one category and the last one, the final days, in another. There's another suggestion, says the Rebbe. Perhaps we can say, as I explained in the introduction, Kiven de nafak mipumi de Rav Kahana, since it, quote, came out of the mouth of Rav Kahana, meaning since the Alter Rebbe lays down this rule and says that it's okay, and therefore they made it a point to go out of the way and to express the fact that their Rebbe, our Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, made this ruling. But then again, says the Rebbe, for this it would have sufficed if they did it just once in the course of the 24 hours of Achrein Shel Pesach. But why in every single dish at every single meal? Which indicates that there's something special, there's something deeper, there's something more unique that needs to be understood, that's kind of like blaring out at us, and we need to delve into it. Says the Rebbe, the point of the explanation is as follows. We know, in general, the difference between Pesach and Shavuos. On Pesach, chametz is absolutely forbidden, absolutely restricted. Whereas on Shavuos, not only it's not absolutely restricted and forbidden, but in fact, it's so much encouraged that it becomes a mitzvah in the Torah to offer the two breads which are made of chametz. It's the only unique mincha that's made of chametz. And this becomes the key to making all the other menachos permissible. In other words, this opens up the way. This opens up the floodgates, if I may, for all the other meal offerings for the rest of the year, because they bring it from the new wheat. What is the explanation? Why this distinction? Why on Pesach it's totally forbidden, and on Shavuos not only it's permitted, but it's actually encouraged to the extent of obligation? The answer is that chametz indicates haughtiness, arrogance, ego, and therefore, as we're beginning our avodah, as we begin, quote, as we're just leaving Egypt, which is the source, the root of all bad, there we have to be very careful. Take absolute care to the extent that the Torah says, Bal Yiro, Bal Yimotza, it's not even belong to. Not only you shouldn't see it and actually use it, you can't even be in ownership of it, of any whatsoever chametz, any whatsoever connection to arrogance and haughtiness. However, on Shavuos, after we already went through the process of avodah, a process of self-perfection, which is expressed in the counting of the Sfiras HaOmer. What is the Sfiras HaOmer? We count the 7 midos, meaning we elevate, we correct, if I may, we perfect our 7 midos, and each one as it consists of the other 7, meaning 7 times 7, a total of 49. Then, when we reach that point, after having gone through that whole process, then chametz, which is representative of arrogance, as I said, of haughtiness, of bad, synonymous with the negativity, not only does it no longer serve as a contradiction, as a problem to one's avodas Hashem, but rather, on the contrary, it actually can become even an asset. It can be used as a positive asset. Just as an example of it could be, again, it's not actual arrogance and haughtiness, but in the family, pride. Pride. A person should be proud of who they are. And that encourages them to continue doing their avodah. That they're actually happy and proud of what they're doing. And this is the ultimate in avodah in general, which is, as the Zohar says, hishapcha chashucha l'nahira, transforming the dark into light. And of course, according to this, we can understand. And in the same vein, the same idea that an Achron Shel Pesach, after having gone through the first 7 days counting of Sfiras HaOmer, which means we already completed one tier of the process of self-perfection, the perfection of our midos, and in fact, which midah? The first midah, the midah of chesed, which really chesed is the generality of all the midas, as it says, it's ozil and kula yoimin. It's kind of every midah, in a sense, is a derivative of chesed. Thus, we already began the process, and in a very general sense, we've completed the process to now be able to perfect all the midos. And therefore, although we're not yet in the level of Shavuos, we have totally perfected all the midas to the nth degree, to the extent that we're able to actually avail ourselves, to utilize chametz, but still, since we've reached already this milestone in the process, that is again the perfection of this one midah, of the first midah, the first 7 days, therefore we don't have to be as careful when it comes to the avodah. We don't have to be so restrictive when it comes to a chash chametz, and therefore we're already allowed to use matzah shruya. We're no longer concerned about the dangers of that. The Gemara explains that since the eating of the matzah on the 7th day of Pesach is a rishus, meaning it's not an obligation, and the Torah clearly states that, then the Torah also makes an association. I'm not going to quote the verses, but it makes an association between the 6 days of Pesach and the 7th day, means it bunches them together. From this, the Gemara concludes that all 6 days of Pesach, and by us in the diaspora, all the last 7 days of Pesach, the consuming of matzah is not a choiva, it's not an obligation, it's not an imperative, rather it's a rishus, meaning it's a voluntary thing. The first night, which is the first day, you must eat a piece of matzah. Or in the case of Chutz La'aretz, the first 2 nights, you must eat matzah. But any other day of Pesach, you don't have to eat matzah. You can choose to eat matzah. It's an elective thing. Now, Chassidus explains that the fact that something is a rishus Meaning the fact that the Torah doesn't impose it on us and force us, so to speak, to do it, meaning that the matzah of the 7 days of Pesach, actually it's because it reaches a higher level than the matzah which we consume on the first night of Pesach. And that's why it's not something you can obligate the person in. Obligation is only for the basic. But something which goes higher, that already, so to speak, is up to the person himself. Now the Rebbe says, how does this apply to Avodah Sa'adam? How do we apply it to our own individual Avodah? You see, the first night, when a person is not yet on one's own accord, ready and predisposed for bittul, for proper bittul, which is expressed in the matzah, therefore the Torah has to impose it on you. Torah says, go ahead and do it. In other words, on your own, you may not be there yet. And therefore the Torah has to give you that nudge, that push, so to speak, that you should go ahead and do it. However, after the avodah of 7 days, that already from when Hashem had, quote, Nigla aleim melech malchem lachem geolam, that Hashem had revealed himself unto the person. And now the person is already becoming more and more receptive. It's sinking in. It's already having its effect. Then you no longer have to force the person to do it. You no longer have to impose it on him. Typically, the person on his own would already be receptive of this and come to it on his own. And this is similar to the above-mentioned idea of at Achron Shel Pesach, we already counted 7 days, and we're already, so to speak, closer there. We're already there, so to speak, on our own. We've already refined ourselves to a degree, and therefore, there's less of concern when it comes to the negativity. However, still, even though we just made somewhat of a comparison between the 7th day of Pesach and Achron Shel Pesach, the idea of eating matzah shruya, still there's a distinction between Shvi'i Shel Pesach and Achron Shel Pesach, between the 7th day of Pesach and Achron Shel Pesach, the last day of Pesach. You see, the 7th day of Pesach is due to the revelation that came from above. As we said, Hashem revealed himself. He exposed his power. On the first day of Pesach, he reveals himself, and thus to the point of the 7th day, it's already sinking in and it's having its effect on us, even though we on our own may have not been there. But it's coming from above. This expresses in the fact that matzah is rishus. It's no longer imposed on you, but it's still matzah. It's still purely matzah, totally devoid of any chametz, totally devoid of any whatsoever ego and arrogance. However, on Achron Shel Pesach, once we've already done the avodah on our own accord, remember the second night we started counting Sfira. Now we have a total of 7 days of our avodah, of self-perfection. Now we're already able to somewhat access even something in the general realm and sphere of chametz, in a sense, and that is by means of being allowed, or not only allowed, but encouraged to use matzah shruya to eat gebroks. Now, this is all an explanation about one detail of Achron Shel Pesach, as it connects to Sfiras HaOmer. In other words, something that we do on Pesach, on Achron Shel Pesach, but it doesn't seem yet to have any direct connection to Achron Shel Pesach. Because as we discussed, this is all due to the fact that we've counted the Omer for 7 days, we've perfected the Midah. But the Rebbe says we have to look for something in this that connects directly and inherently to the idea, to the essence of what Achron Shel Pesach is all about. So the Rebbe says we'll understand this by means of a saying that the Frierdiker Rebbe quotes in the name of the Tzemach Tzedek, where he says as follows: the last day of Pesach is called Achron Shel Pesach. Why is it called Achron Shel Pesach? Why isn't it called the 8th day of Pesach? Because this is the siyum, this is the end, this is the completion of what began on the first night of Pesach. In the first day, we celebrate the fact that Hashem redeemed us through Moshe Rabbeinu with the first redemption. And on the last day, says the Tzemach Tzedek, this is our Yontiv. This is not Hashem's Yontiv. This is our Yontiv, where we celebrate the Geula that's going to be in the future. The Geula Hachrona that Hashem will speedily redeem us through Mashiach, which is the Goyel Achron, the last Redeemer. And says the Rebbe, This is not just some kind of mystical, abstract idea, but rather we find an expression of it in Likkutei Torah, in the revealed part of Torah. Where do we see it? The Haftarah, which we know, as we said in the introduction, the Haftarah inherently is connected to the essence of the day. It brings out the theme, the idea of the celebration about which we're reading, speaks about Mashiach and all the details connected to it. Moreover, as we know, the Baal Shem Tov would eat 3 meals on Achron Shel Pesach. Even though on Yom Tov there's no obligation to eat Shalish Sudas, 3 meals, but he would eat a 3rd meal on Achron Shel Pesach, and he referred to it as Sudas Mashiach. So we see that the day inherently is connected to the idea of Mashiach. Now, what's the fundamental difference between the first redemption and the final redemption? The first redemption, as we know, it says, in reference to it, Ki vorach ha'am, for the people have escaped. In other words, we had to be chased out of there. We had to go out of there in haste. Why so? As it's explained, because we were so entrenched, so deeply buried into the tumah, into the impurities, into the bad of Egypt, that the only way was to kind of chase us out of there, to literally eject us from there and get us out of there as quickly as possible. Whereas in our last redemption, the final redemption, when Mashiach comes, it says, Loi b'chipazon tetzeu, you're not going to go out in haste. And moreover, it says, V'esruach hatuma avim min haaretz, that Hashem says, I'm going to eradicate all bad, all evil from the land, meaning there will be no bad. And therefore, as we stand on Achron Shel Pesach, when we're celebrating the final redemption, we're celebrating the future, that where there's going to, where the light of Mashiach is already shining on this day, we don't have to be so careful from the bad. We don't have to be so scared of it, so to speak, because this is already a celebration of the time of when the bad will be totally eradicated. Moreover, when it comes to the Geula Hasidah, when it comes to the final redemption, not only will the bad be eradicated, but in fact it'll become transformed. As we know that the Psukim indicate that the Yetzer Hara himself will become a good agent. And therefore, not only do we not have to be concerned about Gibrocks, but in fact, as now we understand the explanation, we are actually mehader, we make a point to eat Gibrocks, because now we can avail ourselves of somewhat of this, quote-unquote, what otherwise would be considered bad. And this is also expressed in Likkutei Torah. Where do we see a similar idea in Likkutei Torah on Achron Shel Pesach? The halacha is that if one starts a meal before nightfall on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and they continue it in past nightfall, that meal makes it so that for them, it's still Shabbos or it's still Yom Tov. In fact, we know that Rebbe would do this, right? He started before Shkia, before sunset, and continued it way into the night, and for that person, it's still Yom Tov. To the extent that when they do the Birchas Hamazon, when they bench, they still say Yalav Yavai. They're not allowed to do any Melacha, because for them, it's Yom Tov. Says the halacha that in this final meal of Achron Shel Pesach, if you carry it into the night, past the time that otherwise Pesach would have ended already, you could eat chametz. Now think about it. You could eat chametz. For you, it's still Pesach. Halacha says it's still Pesach for you. But yet you can eat chametz. And after eating chametz, when you conclude that meal, you're going to say Yalav Yovai, meaning you're going to say, for me, it's still Pesach. I'm not even finished yet with Pesach. So you see already we have an idea of this, an aspect of this, that you could still be in Pesach, you're in Achron Shel Pesach, and you can still connect to the chametz aspect, which otherwise is considered bad. Now, although we explained this, this whole explanation was directly focused on the last day of Pesach, but the Rebbe says in general, we can actually bunch up the first 2 days of Pesach versus the last 2 days of Pesach. Meaning that the 7th day of Pesach, even though the way we explained it till now is separate from Achron Shel Pesach and seems to be more connected to the first days of Pesach, but in a sense, says the Rebbe, the 7th day of Pesach, if we want to bunch it as a group, is already connected to the ideas of Achron Shel Pesach, and it already also has somewhat of a connection to the Geula Hachrona, to the final redemption. And that's why, where do we see an expression of this? Says the Rebbe, an expression of this we see right in the first time Pesach. that when it came to the seventh day of Pesach, that's when the Egyptians were eradicated. That's when they were destroyed. The bad was done away with. That began the process for what's going to be completed by when Mashiach comes, that the bad will be totally eradicated. And therefore, this also helps explain, and by the way, we can see it in an actual verse describing the events of what happened by Kriyas Yamsuf. It says, that there was the dark clouds, the darkness and the clouds, but it illuminated the night. So you see already an aspect, an idea of this took place on Shvi Shel Pesach, that the bad, the dark, also served as an agent of good. It also served as an agent of light. The dark became light. And this perhaps can also explain that everything that we discussed in regards to Achon Shel Pesach, this can explain how the people living in Eretz Yisrael who do not have an Achon Shel Pesach, they only have 7 days, how they too eat Sudas Mashiach on the end of their Pesach, which is Shvi Shel Pesach, and still yet get this full effect of what we discussed, the idea of connecting to Geula HaSidra.